Julian Assange of WikiLeaks and MKUltra project, Monarch and Julian Assange. Most of us don't know the beginnings, the early childhood of Julian Assange, Victoria, Australia. So perhaps we would do well to find out what molded him as a person in his first years of life. Origins and techniques of the Monarch mind control and MKUltra projects. Quote, the family, end quote. MKUltra project, Monarch and Julian Assange in Australia. Monarch programming is a method of mind control used by numerous organizations for covert purposes. It is a continuation of Project MKUltra, a mind control program developed by the CIA and tested on the military and civilians. The methods are astonishingly sadistic. Its entire purpose is to traumatize the victim, and the expected results are horrifying. The creation of a mind control slave who can be triggered at any time to perform any action required by the handler. While mass media ignores this issue, over 2 million Americans have gone through the horrors of this program, and now this article looks at the origins of Monarch programming and some of its methods and symbolism. Note, this article contains disturbing elements and might trigger Monarch survivors. Monarch programming is a mind control technique comprising elements of satanic ritual abuse, SRA, and multiple personality disorder, MPD. It utilizes a combination of psychology, neuroscience, and occult rituals to create within the slaves an alter persona that can be triggered and programmed by the handlers. Monarch slaves are used by several organizations connected with the world elite in fields such as the military, sex slavery, and the entertainment industry. Now this article will look into the origins of Monarch programming, its techniques and symbolism. Now the origins. Throughout the course of history, several accounts have been recorded describing rituals and practices resembling mind control. One of the earliest writings giving reference to the use of occultism to manipulate the mind can be found in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. It's a compilation of rituals heavily studied by today's secret societies, which describes methods of torture and intimidation to create trauma, the use of potions, drugs, and casting of spells, hypnotism, of course, curses and satanic whatever, ultimately resulting in the total enslavement of the initiate. Other events ascribed to black magic, sorcery, and demon possession, where the victim is animated by an outside force, are also ancestors of Monarch programming. It is, however, during the 20th century that mind control became a science in the modern sense of the term, where thousands of subjects have been systematically observed, documented, and even experimented on. Methodical. One of the first methodical studies on trauma-based mind control were conducted by Joseph Mengele, a physician working in Nazi concentration camps. He initially gained notoriety for being one of the SS physicians who supervised the selecting of arriving prisoners, determined who would be ended and who was to become a forced laborer. However, he is most known for performing grisly human experiments on camp inmates, including children, for which Mengele was called the Angel of Death. Mengele is infamous for his sordid human experiments on concentration camp prisoners, especially on twins. The part of his work that is rarely mentioned, however, is his research on mind control. Much of his research in this field was confiscated by the Allies and is still classified to this day. Quote, Dr. Green, that is Dr. Joseph Mengele, the most significant programmer, perhaps one could give him the title of the father of Monarch programming, was Joseph Mengele, an ex-Nazi concentration camp doctor. Thousands of Monarch mind-controlled slaves in the U.S. had, quote-unquote, Dr. Green as their chief programmer. Dr. Joseph Mengele of Auschwitz notoriety was the principal developer of the trauma-based Monarch project and the CIA's MKUltra mind control programs. Mengele and approximately 5,000 other high-ranking Nazis were secretly moved into the United States and South America in the aftermath of World War II in the operation designated Operation Paperclip. The Nazis continued their work in developing mind control and rocketry technologies in secret underground military bases. The only thing we were told about was the rocketry work with former Nazi star celebrities like Werner von Braun. The killers, torturers, and mutilators of innocent human beings were kept discreetly out of sight, but busy in United States underground military facilities, which gradually became home to thousands upon thousands of kidnapped American children snatched off the streets, about 1 million per year, and placed into iron bar cages stacked from floor to ceiling as part of the training, quote unquote. These children would be used to further refine and perfect Mengele's mind control technologies. Certain selected children, at least the ones who survived the training, quote unquote, would become future mind control slaves who could be used for thousands of different jobs ranging anywhere from sexual slavery to assassinations. A substantial portion of these children, who were considered expendable, were intentionally slaughtered in front of and by other children in order to traumatize the selected trainee into total compliance and submission, end quote. Mengele's research served as a basis for the covert, illegal CIA human research program named MK-Ultra. Now, MK-Ultra project, MK standing for Mind Control, with a K to honor the Nazis, ran from the early 1950s to at least the 1960s, using American and even Canadian citizens as its test subjects. The published evidence indicates that Project MK-Ultra involved the use of many methodologies to manipulate individual mental states and alter brain functions, including the surreptitious administration of drugs and other chemicals, sensory deprivation, isolation, and verbal and physical abuse. The most publicized experiments conducted by MK-Ultra involved the administration of LSD on unwitting human subjects, including CIA employees, military personnel, doctors, other government agents, prostitutes, mentally ill patients, and members of the general public in order to study their reactions. However, the scope of MK-Ultra does not stop. Experiments involving violent electroshocks, physical and mental torture, and abuse were used in a systematic manner on many subjects, including children. Although the admitted goals of the project were to develop torture and interrogation methods to use on the country's enemies, some historians asserted that the project aimed to create, quote, Manchurian candidates, end quote, programmed to perform various acts such as assassinations and other covert missions. MK-Ultra was brought to light by various commissions in the 1970s, including the Rockefeller Commission of 1975. Although it is claimed that the CIA stopped such experiments after these commissions, some whistleblowers have come forth stating that the project simply went, quote, underground, end quote, and the Monarch programming has become the classified successor of MK-Ultra. The most incriminating statement to date made by a government official as to the possible existence of Project Monarch was extracted by Anton Chaitkin, a writer for the publication of New Federalist, when former CIA Director William Colby was asked directly, quote, what about Monarch, end quote. He replied angrily and ambiguously, quote, we stopped that between the late 1960s and early 70s, end quote. Monarch programming. Although there has never been any official admittance of the existence of Monarch programming, prominent researchers have documented the systematic use of trauma on subjects for mind control purposes. Some survivors, with the help of dedicated therapists, were able to, quote, deprogram, end quote, themselves, to then go on record and disclose the horrifying details of their ordeals. Monarch slaves are mainly used by organizations to carry out operations using patsies trained to perform specific tasks who do not question orders, who do not remember their actions, and if discovered, who automatically commit suicide. They are the perfect scapegoats for high-profile assassinations. See Sirhan. The ideal candidates for prostitution, slavery, and private movie productions. They are also the perfect puppet performers for the entertainment industry. Quote, what I can say is I now believe that ritual abuse programming is widespread, is systematic, is very organized from highly esoteric information which is published nowhere, has not been on any book or talk show, that we have found it all around this country and at least one foreign country. People say, quote, what's the purpose of it? End quote. My best guess is that the purpose of it is that they want an army of Manchurian candidates, tens of thousands of mental robots who will do prostitutions, do movies, smuggle narcotics, engage in international arms smuggling, all sorts of very lucrative things, and do their bidding, and eventually the megalomaniacs at the top believe they'll create a satanic order that will rule the world, end quote. Monarch programmers cause intense trauma to subjects through the use of electroshock, torture, abuse, and mind games in order to force them to dissociate from reality, a natural response in some people when they are faced with unbearable pain. The subject's ability to dissociate is a major requirement, and it is apparently the most readily found in children that come from families with multiple generations of abuse. Mental dissociation enables the handlers to create walled-off personas in the subject's psyche, which can then be programmed and triggered at will. Quote, trauma-based mind control programming can be defined as systematic torture that blocks a victim's capacity for conscious processing through pain, terror, drugs, illusion, sensory deprivation, sensory overstimulation, oxygen deprivation, cold, heat, spinning, brain stimulation, and often near death. And then employee suggestion and/or classical and operant conditioning consistent with well-established behavior modification principles to implant thoughts, directives, and perceptions in the unconscious mind, often in newly formed trauma-induced dissociated identities that force the victim to do, feel, think, and perceive things for the purposes of the programmer. The objective is for the victim to follow directives with no conscious awareness, including execution of acts in clear violation of the victim's moral principles, spiritual convictions, and volition. Installation of mind control programs relies on the victim's capacity to dissociate, which permits the creation of new walled-off personalities to hold and hide programming. Already dissociative children are prime candidates for programming, end quote. Monarch mind control is covertly used by various groups and organizations for various purposes. According to Fritz Springmeier, these groups are known as, quote, the network, end quote. The network and form the backbone of the New World Order. Origins of the name monarch. Monarch mind control is named after the monarch butterfly, an insect who begins its life as a worm, representing undeveloped potential, and after a period of cocooning, programming, is reborn as a beautiful butterfly, the monarch slave. Some characteristics specific to the monarch butterfly are also applicable to mind control. Quote, one of the primary reasons that the monarch mind control programming was named monarch programming was because of the monarch butterfly. The monarch butterfly learns where it was born, its roots, and it passes this knowledge via genetics onto its offspring from generation to generation. This was one of the key animals that tipped scientists off that knowledge can be passed genetically. The monarch program is based upon Illuminati and Nazi goals to create a master race in part through genetics. If knowledge can be passed genetically, which it is, then it is important that parents be found that can pass the correct knowledge onto these victims selected for the monarch mind control, end quote. Quote, when a person is undergoing trauma induced by electroshock, A feeling of lightheadedness is evidenced, as if one is floating or fluttering like a butterfly. There is also a symbolic representation pertaining to the transformation or metamorphosis of this beautiful insect, from a caterpillar to a cocoon, dormancy, inactivity, to a butterfly, new creation, which will return to its point of origin. Such is the migratory pattern that makes this species unique." End quote. The method. The victim or survivor is called a slave, quote unquote, by the programmer handler, who in turn is perceived as the quote unquote master or quote unquote God. About 75% are female, since they possess a higher tolerance for pain and tend to dissociate more easily than males. Monarch handlers seek the compartmentalization of other subject psyche in multiple and separate alter personas, using trauma to cause dissociation. The following is a partial list of these forms of torture. 1. Abuse and torture. 2. Confinement in boxes, cages, coffins, etc., or burial, often with an opening or air tube for oxygen. 3. Restraint with ropes, chains, cuffs, etc. 4. Near drowning. 5. Extremes of heat and cold, including submersion in ice water and burning chemicals. 6. Skinning. Only top layers of skin are removed in victims intended to survive. 7. Spinning. 8. Blinding light. 9. Electroshock. 10. Forced ingestion of offensive body fluids and matter such as blood, urine, feces, flesh, etc. 11. Hung in painful positions or upside down. 12. Hunger and thirst. 13. Sleep deprivation. 14. Compression with weights and devices. 15. Sensory deprivation. 16. Drugs to create illusion, confusion, and amnesia, often given by injection or intravenously. 17. Ingestion or intravenous toxic chemicals to create pain or illness, including chemotherapy agents. 18. Limbs are pulled or dislocated. 19. Application of snakes, spiders, maggots, rats, and other animals to induce fear and disgust. 20. Near-death experiences, commonly asphyxiation by choking or drowning with immediate resuscitation. 22. Forced to perform or witness abuse, torture, and sacrifice of people and animals, usually with knives. 23. Forced participation in slavery. 24. Abuse to become pregnant. The fetus is then aborted for ritual use, or the baby is taken for sacrifice or enslavement. 25. Spiritual abuse to cause victim to feel possessed, harassed, and controlled internally by spirits or demons. So in other words, they curse people, or they ask demons to possess certain specific people, which demons will do. So this is also a very bad spiritual war here. 26. Desecration of Judeo-Christian beliefs and forms of worship, dedication to Satan or other deities. Again, spiritual warfare here. 27. Abuse and illusion to convince victims that God is evil, such as convincing a child that God has abused her. 28. Surgery to torture, experiment, or cause the perception of physical and spiritual bonds or implants. 29. Harm or threats of harm to family, friends, loved ones, pets, and other victims to force compliance. 30. Use of illusion and virtual reality to confuse and create non-credible disclosure. Quote, the basis of the success of the monarch mind control programming is that different personalities or personality parts called alters can be created who do not know each other, but who can take the body at different times. Obviously, this is demon possession of different demons. The amnesia walls that are built by traumas form a protective shield of secrecy that protects the abusers from being found out and prevents the front personalities who hold the body much of the time to know how their system of alters is being used. The shield of secrecy allows cult members to live and work around other people and remain totally undetected. The front altars can be wonderful Christians, and the deeper altars can be the worst type of satanic monster imaginable, like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde effect. A great deal is at stake in maintaining the secrecy of the intelligence agency or the occult group which is controlling the slave. The success rate of this type of programming is high, but when it fails, the failures are discarded through death. A great deal of experimentation and research went into finding out what can and can't be done. Charts were made showing how much torture a given body weight at a given age can handle without death. Due to the severe trauma induced through ECT, abuse and other methods, the mind splits off into alternate personalities from the core, formerly referred to as multiple personality disorder. It is presently recognized as dissociative identity disorder and is the basis for monarch programming. Further conditioning of the victim's mind is enhanced through hypnosis, double-bind coercion, pleasure-pain reversals, food, water, sleep, and sensory deprivation, along with various drugs which alter certain cerebral functions." End quote. Disassociation is thus achieved by traumatizing the subject using systematic abuse and using terrifying occult rituals. Once a split in the core personality occurs, an internal world can be created and alter personas can be programmed using tools such as music, movies, especially Disney productions, and even fairy tales. These visual and audio aids enhance the programming process using images, symbols, meanings, and concepts. Created alters can then be accessed using trigger words or symbols programmed into the subject's psyche by the handler, the master or god. Some of the most important ritual internal images seen by mind-controlled slaves are trees, Kabbalistic tree of life, infinity loops, ancient symbols and letters, spider webs, mirrors, glass shattering, masks, castles, mazes, demons, butterflies, hourglasses. Okay, we know that Assange has an hourglass, of course, as his symbol. Clocks and robots. These symbols are commonly inserted in popular culture movies and videos for two reasons: to desensitize the majority of the population using subliminals and neuro-linguistic programming, and to deliberately construct specific triggers and keys for base programming of highly impressionable monarch children. Some of the movies used in monarch programming include The Wizard of Oz, Alice in Wonderland, Pinocchio, and even Sleeping Beauty. In each case, the slave is given a particular interpretation of the movie's storyline in order to enhance programming. For example, a slave watching The Wizard of Oz is taught that, quote, "somewhere over the rainbow," end quote, is the happy place dissociative trauma slaves must go to in order to escape the unbearable pain being inflicted upon them. Using the movie, programmers encourage slaves to go, quote, "over the rainbow," end quote, and dissociate effectively, separating their minds from their bodies. Quote, "As mentioned before, the hypnotist will find children easier to hypnotize if they know how to do it with small children. One method is effective is to say to the small children, quote, "imagine you're watching a favorite television show," end quote. This is why the Disney movies and the other shows are so important to the programmers. They are the perfect hypnotic tool to get the children's mind to dissociate in the right direction. The programmers have been using movies since almost day one to help children learn the hypnotic scripts. For children, they need to be part of the hypnotic process. If the hypnotist allows the child to make up his own imagery, the hypnotic suggestions will be stronger. Rather than telling the child the color of a dog, the programmer can ask the child. This is where the books and films show the child assists in steering its mind in the right direction. If the hypnotist talks to a child, he must take extra precaution not to change the tone of his voice and to have smooth transitions. Most of the Disney films are used for programming purposes. Some of them are specifically designed for mind control, end quote. Levels of monarch programming. The levels of Monarch programming identify the slave's function and are named after the electroencephalography EEG brainwaves associated with them. Part 2 follows because this is a long description of the programming and life of Julian Assange. The second part also now deals with his life from childhood. Julian Assange and MKUltra project. Monarch and Julian Assange. This is the second part of 2 parts. Part 1 explains in detail the satanic machinations. It's an actual spiritual warfare having to do with, in many cases, demon-possessed people. And I advise that you first listen to part 1. And now we continue with part 2. The levels of Monarch programming. The levels of Monarch programming identify the slave's quote-unquote functions and are named after the electroencephalography EEG brainwaves associated with them, regarded as general or regular programming. Alpha is within the base control personality. It characterized by extremely pronounced memory retention, along with substantially increased physical strength and visual acuity. Alpha programming is accomplished through deliberately subdividing the victim's personality, which in essence causes a left brain, right brain division, allowing for a programmed union of left and right through neuron pathway stimulation. Beta is referred to as sexual, quote-unquote, sexual programming slaves. This programming eliminates all learned moral convictions and stimulates the primitive instinct devoid of inhibitions. Cat, quote, cat alters may come out at this level, known as kitten programming. It is the most visible kind of programming, as some female celebrities, models, actresses, and singers have been subjected to this kind of programming. In popular culture, clothing with feline prints often denote kitten programming. Delta is known as quote-unquote killer programming. Killer programming and was originally developed for training special agents or elite soldiers, such as Delta Force, 1st Earth Battalion, Mossad, etc., in covert operations. Optimal adrenal output and controlled aggression is evident. Subjects are devoid of fear and very systematic in carrying out their assignment. Self-destruct or suicide instructions are layered in this level. Theta, considered to the, quote, psychic program, bloodliners, those coming from multi-generational satanic families were determined to exhibit a greater propensity for having telepathic abilities than did non-bloodliners. Due to its evident limitations, however, various forms of electronic mind control systems were developed and introduced, namely biomedical human telemetry devices, brain implants, that is, directed energy lasers using microwaves and or electromagnetics. It is reported these are used in conjunction with highly advanced computers and sophisticated satellite tracking systems. In conclusion, it's difficult to remain objective when describing the horrors endured by monarch slaves. The extreme violence, the abuse, the mental torture, and sadistic games inflicted on victims by, quote, notable scientists, end quote, and high-level officials prove the existence of the true, quote, dark side, end quote, in the powers that be. Despite the revelations, the documents, and the whistleblowers, a great majority of the population ignores, dismisses, or avoids the issue altogether. Over 2 million Americans have been programmed by trauma mind control since 1947, and the CIA publicly admits its mind control projects. It admitted them in 1970. Movies such as The Manchurian Candidate have directly referred to the subject, even depicting actual techniques such as electroshock, the use of trigger words, and microchip implementation. Several public figures we see on our TV and movie screens are mind control slaves. Famous people such as Candy Jones, Celia Imrie, and Sirhan Sirhan have gone on record and disclosed their mind control experiences, and yet the general public claims that it, quote, cannot exist, end quote. The research and funds invested in Project Monarch do not, however, only apply to mind control slaves. Many of the programming techniques perfected in these experiments are applied on a mass scale through mass media. Mainstream news, movies, music videos, advertisements, and television shows are conceived using the most advanced data on human behavior ever compiled. A lot of this comes from Monarch programming. MK Ultra and MK sleepers, quote unquote, in Australia. A sleeper agent is a spy who is placed in a target country organization, not to undertake an immediate mission, but rather to act as a potential asset if activated. So in other words, sleeper cells, they're just waiting there until they're told to do something, their mission. So a sleeper agent is a spy who is placed in a target country organization, not to undertake an immediate mission, but rather to act as a potential asset if activated. If they are mind controlled and programmed, they most of the time are not even aware to be sleepers, or even agents for that matter, and live a normal life until a pre-programmed sound or command activates them. During the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, the cover for CIA's Monarch and MK Ultra projects in Australia was a sect or cult called The Family, unquote, quote unquote, The Family. It was set up as a school for children, but it was in reality a mind-controlling facility of the CIA. Founded and directed by Anne Hamilton Byrne, The Family made headlines around the world in 1987, when the Australian Federal Police and Community Services of Victoria raided the cult's property at Lake Eildon and took 6 children into care. Police later found 14 children had been brought up in almost complete isolation, believing they were the offspring of Hamilton Byrne and her late husband Bill. In fact, none of them was Hamilton Byrne's, but the children of single mothers who had been pressured into giving them up for adoption, or cult members who did not want them. But it was the way the children had been treated that really shocked the nation of Australia. Hamilton Byrne had ordered the children's hair to be dyed peroxide blonde, and they be dressed in identical outfits. It was also alleged that they had been half-starved, beaten, and forced to take large quantities of tranquilizers to calm them down, quote unquote, and even fed LSD. Known children that were raised in The Family were Martin Bryant, the spree killer who pled guilty to murdering 35 people and injuring 21, others in the Port Arthur massacre, and Julian Assange. Interestingly, they were and still and are both obsessed with their hair and dyeing their hair blonde, a typical trait of the victims of mind control programs they suffered in childhood that does not go away with time. This is media.com, and it's of course on Out of Mind, but I'll continue the article for you. Where the MK Ultra project, Monarch and Julian Assange. We just keep moving. In further exclusive extracts from his unauthorized autobiography, Assange describes a childhood on the run as his memories of school and his experience in Wandsworth prison. So he was also in prison. He says, "My own father was missing from my life and only became part of it again when I was grown up. But it meant that Brett Assange was the male figure I related to, the good father. Brett was one of those cool 1970s people who were into guitars and everything that went with the music scene. I've got his name, Assange, an unusual one which comes from Mr. Sang or Ach Sang in Cantonese. Ach Sang, A-H-S-A-N-G. Assange in Cantonese. This great-great-great-grandfather was a Taiwanese pirate. Brett and my mother divorced when I was 9. He had been good to me and was good in general, but not so good to himself. And the end of their relationship represents the end of a kind of innocence in my life. My stepfather's place in our family was usurped by a man called Leif Meynell, Meynell. I remember he had shoulder-length blonde hair and was quite good-looking. A high forehead and the characteristic dimpled white mark of a smallpox injection on his arm. From the darkness at his roots, it was obvious he bleached his hair. And one time I looked in his wallet and saw that all his cards were in different names. He was some sort of musician and playing the guitar, but mainly he was a kind of ghost and a threatening mystery to us. I was opposed to him from the start. Perhaps that's normal for a boy to resist a man like that, or any man, in fact, who appears to be usurping his father or stepfather. Leif didn't live with us, though my mother must have been besotted with him at first, but whatever her feelings for him was, it didn't last. She would see him off, but then had this ability to turn up and pretend it was otherwise. Eventually, it was a matter of us escaping from him. He would cross the country and only then suffer the sinister realization that he had found us. He'd suddenly be back in our lives, and this grew to be very heavy. He had this brilliant ability to insinuate himself. He punched me in the face once and my nose bled. Another time I pulled a knife on him, told him to keep back from me. But the relationship with him wasn't about physical abuse, it was about a certain psychological power he sought to have over us. In 1980, my mother became pregnant by Leif, and seeing the possible impact of my opposition, he tried at first to be reasonable, pointing out that he was now the father of my brother and that my mother wanted him around. Quote, "But if you ever don't want me around," end quote, he said, quote, "then I'll leave immediately," end quote. He wanted to stay with us and did for a time, but I was conscious of wanting to look after my mother and the baby. My mother was in love with Leif, and I was too young to understand what sexual love was all about. I just knew that he wasn't my father and that he was a sinister presence. He tried again and again to make the case that I should not reject him, and he had this thing with my mother, and he was my brother's father and everything. But a time came when I told him I no longer accepted this deal. He had lied to us in a way that I hadn't known adults could lie. I remember he once said, "All ugly people should be killed." He beat my mother from time to time, and you felt he might be capable of just about anything. I wanted him to leave, as he had promised me he would, but he denied that the conversation ever happened. And so we started moving. Nomadism suits some people. Nomads. It suits some people's situations. We just kept moving because that's what we did. My mother had worked in a new town, and we would find a house there. Simple as that. Except that the moving in these years became, because of Leif, had a degree of hysteria attached, and that, in a sense, took all the simplicity away and replaced it with fear. It would take time for us to understand what the position was, and it was this. Leif Meynell was a member of the Australian cult called the Family. On reflection, I can now see that his obsessional nature derived from that, as well as his egocentricity and his dark sense of control. The Family was founded by a woman called Anne Hamilton Byrne in the mid-1960s. It started in the mountains north of Melbourne, where they meditated, had meetings and sessions where they used LSD. The basic notion was that Anne happened to be a reincarnation of Jesus Christ, but with elements of Eastern philosophy thrown in, such that her followers beheld a karmic deity obsessed with cleansing their souls. Anne prophesied the end of the world, arguing quite comically, though not to her, that only the people in the Dandenong ranges of mountains east of Melbourne would survive. Leif Maynell was part of that cult, and everything he did relating to us was informed by his association with the family. It was so tiring, just moving all the time, being on the run. The very last time we got some intelligence that Leif was drawing close, they told us he was near us in the hills outside Melbourne. My brother and I showed a lot of resistance that final time. We just couldn't bear the idea of grabbing our things again and dashing for the door. As a bride, my mother and I told my little brother he could take his prized rooster, a Rhode Island red, a very tall, proud, strong-looking bird, and also an extremely loud one. To match that, I insisted on taking my 2-story beehive. Picture the scene. A by now hysterical mother and her 2 children, along with the pride of their menagerie, stuffed with a regional station wagon, stuffed into a regular station wagon and heading up the dirt track. On the run, we learned a bit bushcraft. We learned how to get by on very little money and not enough normality. Being unsettled was our normality, and we became good at it. My mother changed her name. We worked out that Leif must have had contacts within the Social Security Administration. That was how the families thought to have worked, so it seemed best to change the names that would be held inside the government computer system. But he was quite a gifted talker and would get friends to supply him with information about our whereabouts, and he would always catch up. It was a private investigator who eventually came and told us about his close relationship with Anne Hamilton Byrne cult. We were living in a fern tree gully. In Fern Tree Gully is the area where they lived, and I was now 16 years old. We'd come to the end of the road. Also, I was feeling almost a man myself and was ready to front up with him. Masculinity and its discontents could be addressed here, but let's just say I knew I could waste him, and he appeared to know it as well. He was lurking outside the bounds of the house, and I walked over and told him to fuck off. It was the first and last time, and something in the way I said this to him ensured that we would never see him again. On being locked up, Julian Assange says, quote, "It was hard to go back to my cell," end quote. My bail hearing took place at the City of Westminster Magistrates Court on Horse Ferry Road on the 14th of December, 2010. The court was packed, and so was the street outside. As I approached in a police van, someone said the roads around Victoria were treacherous, and I smiled, thinking, I've known treachery, so let the roads be at peace with themselves. It was interesting, it was alarming to see how much the prosecution followed the press and allowed a sense of justice to be confused by the many fanatical headlines surrounding me. They needed a villain with silver hair, some kind of cat-stroking nutcase bent on serial seduction and world domination. There was no point opposing it. An impression had been created, and I had neither the skill nor the will to outflank it. But I always knew my lawyers would have to struggle against those who thought they were watching a movie as opposed to trafficking in a person's life. I was granted bail on the 14th, only to be told that the Swedish authorities had appealed against the decision and that I would have to be sent back to Wandsworth. It was hard to take, having to leave my friends and supporters behind once again, having to leave the talking to my lawyers, having to sit inside the prison van once more as it crawled through the media scrum. It was hard to enter my cell once more, and I heard the door shut behind me. But as I had told my mother before the hearing, my convictions were unfaltering and my ideals were not shaken by my circumstances. After 2 more nights in jail, I was back in court, the High Court this time on December 16th. I have nothing profound to say about the judge, except to suggest that he behaved throughout as if there was a correspondent from the Times perched on his shoulder. It was hard otherwise to see why he reckoned my bail should be so high and my tagging so severe. In his mind, I was some kind of shadowy, movie-style kingpin linked to disappear, likely to disappear at any minute in a puff of smoke, a souped-up helicopter, or a hail of light laser fire. In fact, my circumstances were more ordinary than he could have known. I had no home and no car. I had hardly any possessions and a bag of phones. I just didn't get it. He just didn't get it, and meted out punishment as though it might be preemptive. I had no charge against me and was wanted for questioning in a country whose motives I presently had no reason politically to trust. That was it. Finally, the money raised for bail by my supporters came through, and the Swedish appeal was rejected. I was about to be free. How long that freedom would last was questionable, but at the High Court, the moment was for jubilation. In trouble with authority. Quote, 2 policemen quickly turned up at the door. End quote. I went to well over 30 schools in all. Early on, that peripatetic life was heavenly. It gave me a sense of meeting new challenges all the time. It felt like we were gulping down experience without fear. I was probably the kind of child who was shopping for things to take a stand against. I remember one day my folks were making dinner and found they were short of tomatoes. The neighbors had loads of tomatoes, but they wouldn't give us any. So the next day I began digging a tunnel from our garden to theirs. I got some of my little gang involved, bringing shovels and candles to get the job done. We got under the fence in secret, came away with 2 baskets of tomatoes. I handed one of them to my mother, and she had this grin. 2 policemen quickly turned up at the door, and they too were grinning. They just stood there, rocking on their heels. It was my first run-in with the law. We handed back 1 basket of tomatoes, and the scandal reverberated. But I was happy that I still had the 2nd basket of tomatoes hidden. They sent me to some kind of Steiner-style school where it was all about expressing myself. There was an obnoxious little girl who wouldn't share, and in accordance with the school's philosophy, I decided to express myself without hindrance, so I hit her over the head with a hammer. This caused a great fuss, of course, and I had to leave, although the girl was fine. We just kept moving. Book offer. These abridged extracts are from Julian Assange, the unauthorized autobiography published by Canongate. Hardback is £20, ebook is about £15. The strange upbringing of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. Australian hacker Julian Assange, WikiLeaks silver-coiffed leader, increasingly appears to be the main character in Web 2.0 Mad Max sequel. His past includes a carefree childhood, escaping a cult and motorcycling around Vietnam. WikiLeaks.org is the whistleblowing website that's responsible for dozens of high-profile leaks, including this year's Iraq attack helicopter video. Much of the information contained in the long profile of Assange is this week's New Yorker's is not new. Assange and his haphazard crew are overly paranoid. Assange is a passionate crusader who sees WikiLeaks as the vanguard in a new movement for radical transparency. Assange is sort of a weirdo hobo who travels the world with a duffel bag full of socks. WikiLeaks video demonstrates conclusively that innocent people get killed in wars. WikiLeaks is an admirable organization and has admirably published videos of 2 Reuters. New York reporter Rafi Khachaturian delves deep in Assange's past, and we learn about the abbreviated childhood that shaped his obsessions. Assange for a time lived in the tiny magnetic island off the coast of Australia. He was homeschooled, grew up riding horses and making rafts, and when he was 8, his mom hooked up with a musician and things got weird. The musician became abusive, he says, and they separated. A fight ensued over the custody of Assange's half-brother, and Claire felt threatened, fearing that the musician would take away her son. Assange recalled her saying, quote, "Now we need to disappear," end quote, and he lived on the run with her from the age of 11 to 16. When I asked him about the experience, he told me that there was evidence that the man belonged to a powerful cult called the Family. Its motto was unseen, unknown, unheard. Some members were doctors who persuaded mothers to give up their newborn children to the cult's leader, Anne Hamilton Byrne. The cult had moles in government, Assange suspected, who provided the musician with leads on Claire's whereabouts. They escaped and moved across the street from an electronics store where Assange learned computers. Eventually, Assange became a part of a hacking collective known as the International Subversives, adopting the moniker MENDAX, MENDAX. He fell in love with a 16-year-old girl and joined a squatters' union with her. After a series of increasingly brazen capers, he got arrested for hacking and spent some time wandering in the wilderness and tooling around Vietnam on a motorcycle. Really, how could this guy end up becoming anything but the shadowy leader of an activist network dedicated to exposing government secrets? This is quoted from the New Yorker. I'll leave a link below for you for this on Out of Mind.